The Middle East is not at peace as the United States military launched a campaign of targeted strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. A dozen F-18 fighters took off from an aircraft carrier, destroying more than 60 Houthi targets. Then, Arleigh burke missile destroyers fired multiple Tomahawk cruise missiles, hitting the newly redesignated terrorist group. And I can't help but feel like, here we go again. These strikes reached out and touched Houthi command centers, missile launchers, and leadership sites. But will this return freedom of navigation to the Red Sea? Welcome back, Spare Parts Army. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, and today I want to examine what impact these airstrikes may have on the Houthis' overall capabilities. We'll tally up exactly how much of America's air defense stockpile has been expended in this fight, and how the Houthis are attempting to respond. Starting in 2023, the Houthis began firing ballistic missiles at civilian and warships in the Red Sea, disrupting roughly 12% of global shipping. Since then, coalition airstrikes have been unable to stop them. We've learned that distributed missile teams are like weeds that are very difficult to root out. Since then, a ton has changed for the Iranian-backed group. They've officially been given the honor of being redesignated as a terrorist organization. So what's different this time with these attacks, you ask? Well, we can start to get a better idea of the impact of these strikes by taking a look at this live conflict map, which is kind of like a weather map, but for war. It's a war map, if you will. You can see these red bomb icons are the exact geolocated places of precision strikes. This view breaks down the battle space Barney style so we can understand at a high level what's happening in the battle space. The attacks focused on several locations in Sana'a, which is Yemen's largest city, including a power station that took out electricity to a section of the entire city. Within Sana'a is a section known as Eastern Garaf, which was hit by 4 munitions. They were targeting the Houthi military headquarters that are spread out throughout this city. But one of the big challenges here with this operation is that Sana'a is densely populated with 3.5 million people living here. I think by looking closer at the range of weapons that are used in the attack, it'll tell us a lot about the intended effects on target. So video footage from CENTCOM, released on X, showed multiple F-18 fighter jets carrying a payload of AGM-154 joint standoff weapons. I'll never not think that it's weird that the powers that be on both America and Houthis post highlight reels of their kills online on X, where I also tweet dick jokes. But the point of what I'm saying is that those AGM-154s have an accuracy that is so precise, you can hit within 3 meters of where you're aiming. The AGM-154 can be outfitted with a range of warheads, but all the pilots I know strongly endorse that 500-pound bomb as choice. Another video released showed the F-18s loaded up with a payload of AGM-84H standoff missiles, which has a super long range of 250 kilometers. This keeps the pilot at a safe distance away from that air defense because nobody wants to get downed over enemy territory. Houthis have been firing a ton of anti-air missiles at American pilots who have so far managed to duck them, although some Reaper drones were not as lucky. Pour some out for my drone homies. The key feature of the AGM-84 is that it allows the operator to steer that missile in the final approach to the target. If you've ever gotten a kill streak in Call of Duty, you already know what it's like to use this weapon. It makes the AGM-84 highly accurate against high-value targets. And normally I would love to be considered highly valued, but when it comes to US airstrikes, the last thing I want to be is someone who's highly valued, because the live conflict map shows at least one high-valued Houthi security official was killed in the strike just north of Sana'a in that initial wave. If you're like me and you're wondering what makes these new strikes any different from the old ones, still, according to reports, one of the main changes here is that US forces are now targeting Houthi political leadership instead of just the launch sites, instead of just the training bases, instead of just the storage facilities. So the goal here appears to be an attempt to dismantle the Houthis' organizational structure, although US officials are still insisting that regime change is not what they're aiming at. Do you pinky promise? No, the goalpost has been set at returning deterrence and preventing the Houthis from threatening ships in the sea. And to hammer that commitment home, on March 21st, the United States upped the ante by sending a second aircraft carrier strike group to the Middle East, doubling their combat power and sending a strong indication that the intensity of the attacks are about to increase. If someone sent 2 multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers after me, I wouldn't even be mad. I would be impressed. That's an honor. What this means, though, is there will now be somewhere in the ballpark of a combined 180 fighter jets on 2 aircraft carriers. This also increases capability to defend the civilians in the Red Sea who are trying to send shipping through here, and that's because they have an influx of interceptors that can take out the Houthis' ballistic munitions. We saw CENTCOM tweeted out, for instance, video of American fighter jets blasting Houthi drones out of the sky like a fireworks display. One of the reasons I think the US military wants to see a fast end to the conflict here is so they can reduce their use of air defense munitions that they're expending. Since 2023, the US Navy has been just yeeting expensive air defense munitions left and right, to the tune of 400 munitions, or about $1 billion worth of interceptors. Is that a waste or the best live fire training event of your entire career? I don't know, but the good part of that was that it gave sailors and pilots a ton of practice and useful data to improve interceptors' performance and hit rate in the future. But the downside was some claim that it was eating through stockpiles. The arsenal was getting depleted. The Navy hasn't fired this many missiles since your dad served in it way back in dang World War II. The US Department of Defense says that their warships were targeted over 170 times, and commercial ships were targeted 145 times since 2023. In response, to protect these ships, the Navy fired a total of 400 munitions, not missiles, but 400 munitions. Sources from the Navy said that included 120 of the older SM-2 missiles, 80 of the newer, more advanced, technologically fancy SM-6 missiles, and 20 of the Sea Sparrow and SM-3 missiles. So in total, that's about 200 missiles per year, and add on to that 160 cannon shots from their 5-inch guns. But I'd like to know, is this really burning through America's overall stockpiles of missiles, or does someone just want monies to buy more missiles? Currently, the Navy's manufacturing 17 of the SM-2 missiles, 12 of the SM-3s, 125 of the fancy SM-6s per year. So their total manufacturing production adds up to about 154 of these new missiles produced annually. Based on the Navy's reports, they fired roughly 200 missile interceptors in total in combat in the Red Sea. So that's a net loss of about only 46 missiles per year from existing stockpiles. And what is the existing stockpile? Fortunately, we have open source numbers from weapons contracts that reveal there's an estimated to be around 12,000 of the older SM-2 missiles produced, 470 SM-3s, and 1,600 of the SM-6s, and about 3,000 Sea Sparrows that have been produced in total. So the open source stockpile estimates that there's a total of roughly 17,000 air defense munitions in the stockpile. Even if the US Navy fired actually 2 or 3 times as many missiles in Red Sea combat, the cost would still only work out to a net loss of about 100 interceptors per year. But the open source numbers say that the missile costs between $5 and $28 million each, while the 5-inch cannons cost about $2,000 per desk pop, and that's roughly the full cost of doing business in protecting the Red Sea. That's not including the Patriot air defense missile. The US is on track to produce 650 Patriot missiles per year, and they've made over 10,000 of them in its lifespan. What we're talking about is a concept known as magazine depth, and it's affected by a number of different variables, like how many of those missiles are sold or sent to allies around the world, and it's impacted by how many missiles are in any given theater at any given time. We can take solace, though, in the fact that the US military spends close to $1 trillion a year, and we're likely not going to run out of missiles defending the Red Sea. However, here's why, personally, I think there's still a valid concern here, though. Because if this rate of expenditure continues for, say, another 2 years, it's using missiles that could be used elsewhere. Military leadership and Congress agree that magazine depth should be increasing right now by hundreds, not decreasing by 100. I think the bigger strategic concern here is that the stockpile is way too low when you account for a major war with a near peer. So I think two things can be true here right now at the same time. Combat in the Red Sea isn't going to really make a huge difference on the stockpiles, and two, the US military probably needs a much larger missile stockpile for a near peer war. The Navy also expended roughly 100 Tomahawk cruise missiles in 1 month, which is roughly a year's stockpile in one single month. The Navy's cruise missile inventory isn't exactly publicly available for us to check like inventory at Costco, but based on previous purchase orders, over its entire lifespan, the Navy has procured 9,000 Tomahawks. Firing a few hundred in these strikes isn't believed to put a major dent in that arsenal. They aren't acquiring new ones really right now. Instead, they're focusing on upgrading existing stockpiles, but the point is, when this started happening, I was curious if the Navy might switch away from using the expensive air defense missiles for cheaper alternatives, which it looks like they've started doing. They fired 160 rounds from the Arleigh Burke's 5-inch guns that are on the deck, which successfully destroyed Houthi drones. They likely used a special kind of proximity-fused airburst ammunition, or a second kind of 5-inch ammo that's a canister round, which is packed with these metal balls that spray out. It's like a giant 5-inch shot. That's crazy. That's a crazy shotgun. The great thing about this option is the ship has 600 rounds of those that they can go full send with, so you don't have to feel like you just shot out the taxes of a small state every time you fire it. The downside is you have to let the explosive drone get within 16 kilometers of the ship to get within range, which, if we do some average infantryman math here together for just a second, if I'm a drone traveling at an average of speed of a Houthi drone of 320 kilometers per hour, I will ruin your day in about 3 minutes. So it's cutting things close. It's not a lot of standoff. But how might the Houthis respond to these attacks? That gets us into that section, because they claim that they've fired 18 ballistic missiles and attack drones at the aircraft carrier strike group. A U.S. general in charge of the operation had this to say.
Houthis claim to have tried to attack the Harry S. Truman. Quite frankly, it's hard to tell because while we're executing precision strikes, they missed by over 100 miles. So I would just tell you, their effectiveness, I would question anything that they claim in the press that they're doing or not doing. It's very hard to tell what they are just based on their level of incompetence.
The retaliation so far by the Houthis has been unsuccessful. What they have been successful in doing, though, is increasing the stress and workload on the Navy. Sailors who are braving these conditions have reported working 80 to 100-hour weeks, occasionally for long, extended stretches. The USS Truman Carrier Strike Group is going to have their deployment extended by at least a month now, keeping them away from friends and family back home. Routinely, the Navy is having their deployments extended from 6 to 9 months, like we're back in GWOT again. There have also been gaps in coverage because there weren't enough ships to send through the Red Sea. The Navy's described this experience as an opportunity to learn how to manage long combat deployments that are extended. That's seeing the glass half full. The other major takeaway was this was the first time in history that I'm aware of where ground-launched anti-ship ballistic missiles and new kamikaze attack drones were fired in anger at American warships. There are similar kinds of systems that would potentially be fired by China in the future being fired at these sailors, and the sailors in the US Navy now have good data and proof that their interceptors work. It's a major confidence booster, although some missiles did reportedly get a little too close for comfort. And the other important geopolitical aspect to examine here is the Iranian connection. So this is a Iranian-backed proxy, and these strikes are happening at the same time as the US government is turning to focus on Iran. They're increasing economic pressure on Iran and trying to reach some kind of settlement on Iran's nuclear program. The United States signaled that if Iran refuses to enter into nuclear talks, then military action could come next. The US and Iran have been in this kind of low-key proxy war going on between the two for years, but America so far has not conducted large-scale direct strikes against Iran since 1980s. After nearly a week of waves of airstrikes, my personal assessment so far is that these strikes will put pressure on the Houthis and it will hurt their capabilities, but if the past is any indication of the future, it won't be able to stop them outright. I say that because the Houthis have been bombed by the Saudis, the United States, the UK for years now, and they still manage to operate with the help of Iran. Usually for an air campaign to be successful in destroying a force and its capabilities, there needs to be some kind of major ground campaign in coordination with it, like when ISIS was largely destroyed thanks to major partner forces on the ground also fighting, which is something we don't see in Yemen. Air and missile campaigns alone historically have limited outcomes. When the White House was asked about this, they answered that they haven't ruled out using ground forces at this time, but that would likely be unpopular of a decision if it was made. So US officials stated there were still a number of alternatives to actual troops on the ground. These soldiers often conduct important site exploitation missions, which get intelligence for future strikes and intelligence on where these weapons are coming from. Just recently, in late January 2025, we saw the Houthis stop their attacks. The Houthis, they say that their Red Sea attacks are in solidarity with the Palestinians, so it's important for me to point out that once the war in Gaza ends, then these attacks will hopefully end as well, and hopefully there's a diplomatic solution here. So thank you, Spare Parts Army, for watching. If you want to support the work I do, consider following me on Instagram at CappyArmy. Signing off this net, time now.